Hey y'all, howdy and welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell and let's talk about July. I read 5 books and hauled 5 books. So we'll go through these in order of the books I read first and then the books I hauled, and I'll just talk about them in the order that I read them. So kicking it off. We have Oathbringer, which is book 3 of the Stormlight Archive. I will say this is probably my least favorite of the 3 Stormlight books so far. There's nothing really like distinctive I can sink my teeth into as to the why of that statement. It just was the vibes. This one, I also I just don't know how to talk about it because it's the 3rd book in a series. It was the longest book in the series so far. I think there was like 1,200 something pages. Yeah, it was over 1,200 pages. But can we just take a minute to admire the sick art on the inside? Wow. I absolutely love this. And there's 2 more in the back of the book. Wow. I love beautiful books so much. Okay, Oathbringer, book 3. The description on Goodreads actually gives away a lot of information. So I was reading that to try and let myself know how much I could actually give away without being spoilery. So in this one, again, this is not a spoiler if you read the description on the back, but in this one, the Voidbringers have come back. And so the real war for the planet has begun, I guess. Dalinar is trying to figure out how to unite all of these different countries to fight against this common enemy. I really liked that in this one, Kaladin is just having a bit of like an internal struggle of self-reflection, I guess, just trying to figure out what is the just side of this war, which was an interesting way to take it, I think, for him. Shallan also has a bit of a journey dealing with her own trauma and magic, and her personality really starts to fray. In this one, she really struggles to have value in herself and to trust herself to deal with her own problems. And really, she just tries to bury all of her trauma, and that kind of leads to almost like a schizophrenic situation, but with magic, which I thought was really cool. I also really liked the more page time that Adolin got in this book. Adolin is Dalinar's son. He is a important soldier and shard bearer, but he is not one of the Knights Radiant. He has no like magical powers. And so him kind of dealing with what is his place in this war without being as powerful as all of his friends and allies, and just some realizations that he has. I also liked the way that his and Shallan's relationship developed towards the end of the story. I really liked. Yeah, I mean, when I say that this is probably my least favorite of the 3, this was still a 5-star book. This book was fantastic. The Stormlight Archive is just so far above most fantasy that I read. Like, I have no notes. It was 5 stars. I had 2 other 5-star books this month out of the only 5 books that I read. So it was a pretty big banger of a month. But the book that I read following Oathbringer was not one of those books. If you saw my vlog earlier this month, I will link it below. It was my blind date with a book. So if you don't want to be spoiled for what that book is, go watch that video. That book was The History of Bees by Maja Lundy. I never looked up how to say her name, I'm sorry. This was tagged by the bookseller as for fans of Station 11 with themes of beekeeping and parent-child relationships. And I thought that sounded really cool. I love bees. Oh, and it also said there were like multiple timelines, which I also generally love that kind of stuff, and seeing how the author ties together these seemingly unrelated timelines and characters. This one unfortunately didn't hit for me. It was very meh. Nothing about it really gave me any strong feelings throughout. I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't a bad book. It was well written. The first timeline, the earliest timeline, is like in the 1800s, and it is following a deeply depressed man who has like 8 children. and he can't motivate himself to get out of bed and participate in his family life. He struggles with, he had wanted before children to be a natural scientist and then became too busy being a provider for his family and never really got the chance to follow his dream. It's just about him trying to grapple with, how do I find meaning in my life again? How do I make my children respect me? How do I contribute to the scientific field? That sort of thing. It's just a very sad story for him because he is so depressed, and also just because he has those mental health struggles, but he also just like doesn't really participate in his family at all. He doesn't really care about his children very much. So I just had a really hard time connecting to him. The second character, second timeline, is a farmer in the year like 2007. His son is away at college, but he wants his son to come back and take over the family business, take over the farm when he's done with college, and his son has pretty much no interest in doing so. And it's about him, the farmer, trying to grapple with that and accept his son's choices, and he really doesn't. He can't let go of the idea of his son not being the person that he thinks he is. So again, this is another kind of sad man living a sad life type of thing. He is a beekeeper. He takes his bees around to different farms to pollinate their crops. And 2007, 2008 is kind of when colony collapse disorder really came into the forefront of the news at a national level. And so he is also grappling with the future of his farm altogether and the future of bees. Our final timeline is set in China. I believe it's like in the 2050s or maybe even like 2090s. I can't remember. It's sometime in the far near future. The woman is a mother of a child of 3. Her job is to climb up trees every day and paint pollen onto each individual flower because there are no more bees in existence on planet Earth. And they have to be able to pollinate all of these crops in order for food to grow to feed humanity. That's pretty much how most of Chinese citizens are employed, and there's rampant poverty. Society has come really close to collapse. Pretty much everyone lives a pretty bleak life. Her family finally gets a day off of work, and her husband and her 3-year-old go out into the forest to just like enjoy their day off. Something really tragic happens. Her son has to be rushed to the hospital. And then after they get to the hospital, they're not allowed to see their child. And then after they're there for like a day or two in the hospital, just like desperately trying to find out what's going on and why people won't tell them what's happening and why they won't let them see her son, they tell her that her child was rushed off to a hospital in Beijing where there are specialists. And so it really becomes a story of her just like tracking down her child and trying to figure out what happened to him after her child was basically like disappeared by the government, and getting behind the conspiracy there. The last kind of dystopian storyline was by far the most interesting of the stories. It was sad. All of these were sad. It still kind of had like a hopeful note at the very end, but again, nothing about this book really stood out to me. It was just fine. The third book that I read this month, I had an ebook from the library, and you can't tell how beautiful this cover is on my Kindle because it's black and white. So I will just post a picture up here because wow, the cover really grabbed my attention, and that's why I read this book this month. This is a new release nonfiction called Sing Like Fish: How Sound Rules Life Underwater. And I just felt like this was a great summer read. I love water sports. I love swimming. I love whitewater kayaking. I love floating down the river in a tube. Like, I love boating. I love fishing. So this just seemed like the perfect nonfiction to pick up at this time. And I gave this 5 stars. This was another one of my fantastic reads of the month. This is a environmental journalist, and she talks to scientists, environmental researchers all over the world, really, to get this book together. She spends multiple years interviewing people, going to research stations, going to laboratories, and learning about everything that she put into this book. And that's honestly kind of my favorite type of nonfiction, just a really deep dive into a natural topic by someone who has a lot of expertise or talks to all the people with all of the expertise. It's simultaneously about how important noise is for underwater species, how they communicate with each other, but also how human noise is impacting all of the underwater life. It's really incredible. Sound travels 4 times faster underwater than it does in the air. That's why when you're underwater, if you've ever been swimming underwater and you hear a sound, you can't tell where it's coming from. And this is all stuff I learned in the book. I learned so many cool things reading this. But apparently, if you hear a sound in the air, the way that your mind directionally tells you where that sound came from is because of the distance between your ears, the amount of time it takes for the sound to hit one ear versus the sound to hit the other ear. Your brain basically does some complicated math without you even knowing and triangulates the sound based on how long the sound took to get from one ear to the other ear, which is crazy. But because sound travels 4 times faster underwater, there's not enough distance between your ears, or between any species' ears really, to understand where sound comes from. And so that makes it really challenging for researchers when they're trying to study underwater sound, because there's not a comprehensive catalog of what species make what sounds. And in order to figure out which species, like if you're trying to study a coral reef, for instance, and you just have like microphones and cameras sitting out, you might hear all these different sounds, but and fish and other creatures often don't have to open their mouths to make sound. They make sounds with their guts or with their fins or with their pinchers or lots of other things. So you really have to isolate an animal in order to tell if it is the one that is making the sound. And that's very hard to do, and often animals in laboratories don't make the same sounds that they would out in the wild. So it goes into all these different kind of issues, and it talks about whale songs and fish mating calls and things like that, but also the impact of boating and shipping. The sound that the motors of the boats makes can drastically reduce the amount of sound that can get out for a fish. For example, if a fish like mating sound or whatever normally would travel, I'm going to make up some numbers here, like 400 meters or whatever. But because it's like in a busy shipping lane, the sound might only travel like 100 meters because there's so much outside sound. And so that fish is either going to have to try to sing or make that sound significantly louder to reach the same amount of distance that it historically has been able to reach, or it's going to have to just deal with the consequences of finding less mates and being a less successful species. So I could go on and on. I could probably talk about this book for another 20 minutes. I won't make you guys suffer through it. But if that kind of stuff sounds interesting to you, I highly, highly recommend this book. It was super fascinating. The author, Amarina Kingdon, I believe was her name, she was like out on these boats. She was diving with these researchers. And so it has a lot of that style of narrative as well, talking about her experiences, learning about these things, going on these kind of sea adventures with all of these people. And that was really, really cool. Sing Like Fish, recommend. Okay, the 4th book that I read this month and the final 5-star book, Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio, I think is how you say his name. So this is the sci-fi book that has taken BookTube by storm this year. I've been wanting to read this for a couple of years already, but I picked this up at Powell City of Books in my only other book haul of the year so far. So I'll link that video as well if you want to see my book haul at Powell's. This book is the start of a 7-book series called The Sun Eater. It follows the main character, Hadrian, who is a son of a noble house. And he just has really lived like a privileged life. He's been taught fencing, fighting, sparring type stuff, and also like all of the scholarly things. Humanity at the same time is at war with this alien species called the Sealson, but the war is so far away from his home planet that it's basically just like something that he hears about on the news. It's not crazy relevant to his personal life. He is the eldest son of his father, and his father owns a mining industry. They're like a very, very rich family because of this uranium mining, but his family are all pretty awful. They're not like a traditional sort of family in any way, but he is under the impression that he's going to be his father's heir, and then finds out pretty early in the book that his father has never declared an heir and like kind of scoffs at the idea that Hadrian thinks he's going to be the heir of the house. He then kind of embarrasses his father, and his father decides to ship him away to be a member of this church, which Hadrian does not believe in the faith of this church. He really thinks they're like propagandists, they're awful, they are torturers and inquisitors, and kind of like very Spanish Inquisition sounding. Like everyone is a heretic unless you are one of their people. So Hadrian basically flees from that fate, and the rest of the book is kind of the fallout of what happens when he decides to do that. So I won't go into everything that happens, but suffice to say, Hadrian lives many different lives within this book and just faces a lot of challenges. I really like the way that this went down. I really liked his character, and he is the reason that all of the things in his life go wrong, besides his like terrible family, obviously. But once he's out from under his family's thumb, like so many things go wrong, and it's always Hadrian's fault. And I just felt so bad for him because he was just trying to do the best that he could, but the outcomes never happened the way that he wanted them to. And I am super excited to see what happens. Like, so much happened in this book that I absolutely no idea where the rest of the series is going to go. But the basic premise behind this is that we know, just based on like the description, that Hadrian eventually like blows up an entire planet or like genocides an entire species or something like that. He's like in prison as an old man, like 1,000 years from now, and he's writing this memoir of like what happened in his life. So it's very kind of like Name of the Wind in that sort of storytelling dynamic. I've also heard this compared to Red Rising, which I kind of get, because like the nobles in this world are so far above the normal people because they live for thousands of years and they're like genetically perfect. And so it's very much like a golds versus reds thing in that sort of sense. And then the other book that I've heard this compared to is Dune. The similarities to Dune at the beginning of the book are like really stark. Like if you've read Dune, like you see it immediately. The inspiration that the author took from that is like very obvious. But other than like some world building things, the story itself is not like Dune. But I do get the comparisons to all three of those: Name of the Wind, Red Rising, and Dune. So it's not like those three things had a baby though. It just like, it had elements of all of those, and I can understand why people compare it to them. So hopefully I pitched this well. I loved it. I am getting ready to start book 2, and I can't wait to see what happens next. The final book that I read this month, I also had a separate video for, and that's because it was a Kickstarter that I participated in, so I will link that video down below. But this is Daniel Greene's book, A Witch's Sin, book 1 of Neon Ghosts. If you want to hear my really in-depth thoughts, I will be sure to link that video down below. That was a fun one. I did like the whole unboxing and vlog for it. So this is a cyberpunk kind of sci-fantasy realm with basically, I would call it like a dystopian cyberpunk with vampires and magic. So the premise of the story is that our main character, Taya, is an enforcer. She is basically a person who has a lot of built-in tech like in her skin that makes it so that she can take a lot of hits and kind of be the type of like shoot first, ask questions later character, which I really enjoyed. She is assigned to a missing child case. It looks like it's pointing towards this vampire that took the child and sucked it dry, but it turns out to be something far vaster and a conspiracy that kind of involves the entire structure of the tower where humanity lives. The first half of the book I felt like was a little bit slow. It was just kind of that standard kind of detective cop sort of storyline, but with some cyberpunk vampire elements. And then the second half of the book got really explosive and fun and had a lot more emotional impact, but was also just like a more interesting and engaging story. As I said in the vlog, if book 2 was already out, I would definitely pick it up right away. But this was a really fun one and I recommend it. I ended up giving this a solid 4 on Goodreads. So those were all the books that I read in July, but I also went on a tiny shopping spree. I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about before if you've been on the channel for a while, the International Book Project in Lexington. Fantastic nonprofit, and they also have a little bookshop inside where all the money that you buy your books with goes directly back to the organization. All of their paperbacks, because they're used books, they're all donated. The paperbacks are $3 and the hardbacks are $5. So I got 5 books for $17. And that's why I love the International Book Project. On top of the fact that they're just like an incredible organization with an amazing mission. If you ever want to give to a bookish nonprofit, I highly recommend checking out the International Book Project. But let's talk about these books real quick. I don't know very much about them, so I'm just gonna do this really briefly. But the first one I got was God Killer by Hannah Connor. I love the cover on this. I think this is part of the reason that this book intrigues me. I know that there is something to do with a character that literally slays gods. And that was enough for me, this cover and that concept. So I am excited to pick this up at some point in the future. Una Out of Order by Margarita Montemor. I believe this is like a contemporary, vaguely sci-fi sort of story where this woman, Una, is experiencing her life out of time, out of order. She keeps waking up at different times in her own life and has to kind of figure out what's going on, why her life is the way it is, and why she is not able to live her life in a chronological way. So that sounds fun. Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. Ancillary Justice is the start of a sci-fi series that I have heard more and more about over the years. The Translation State is a book in this world that was on the Goodreads Choice Awards last year, and I think that's how I first became clued into this book. I honestly have no idea what this is about, but because I hear people talking about it frequently and it's sci-fi, I decided to pick it up. It's $3, I can't go wrong. Oh, and yeah, also I got a cute bookmark with my purchase, which talks about their mission on the back. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is one of the books that I mentioned in my 40 classics to read before I turned 40 video. And yeah, I'm pretty sure The Metamorphosis is about a man that wakes up as a beetle. It's a classic. This also has other stories by Franz Kafka in here. So if I do end up liking The Metamorphosis, then I'll probably read the rest of the stories in the book. And the final book that I hauled this month was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. I've never read anything by Ann Patchett, but she is a well-loved contemporary author, and apparently this was a Reese's Book Club pick. I don't know that I've ever actually read a Reese's Book Club pick before, but I picked this up because my friend Chrissy recommended this to me because she saw that I liked City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. It was another book that my friend Chrissy had recommended, and so she was like, oh, if you liked that, you'll probably like this. I don't really know what this is about. I know it's set during the COVID pandemic, and it is about a woman's daughters coming back to the orchard where she lives, where they grew up, and like her just like reflecting to them on her life. I don't know. I didn't read the inside cover before showing it to you guys, so that's all I needed. My friend Chrissy said I would probably like it, so yeah, again, this was $5. If I don't like it, I can give it to a little free library. So, whoop. This is my haul. Hopefully I'll get some winners out of this stack. And this was my books that I read this month with my Kindle in the middle representing Sing Like Fish. Great stack of books. Please let me know down in the comments below what your favorite book was in the month of July, or what your opinions are on any of the books that I read or hauled this month if you have already read them. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me a little bit today. As always, please be kind, drink water, read more books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you next time.